Thank you so much, Shirel. It's great to be back. And hello, everybody. It's already 7 p.m. in Warsaw, and it has been a gloomy day. So it's really, I'm very happy to have this treat at the end of this day and be able to meet you all. I will now share my screen, and hopefully, you'll be able to see it in a moment. And I'm about to take you on a journey to a very particular place that is dear to my heart. It is a house with a secret, and I was privileged enough to be part of the process of rediscovering the hidden story behind this very unspectacular house. But you'll see the story is indeed spectacular. So I'm gonna be taking you there, and but I will start with telling you a little bit about sort of the context of that. So this is a house in contemporary Polish town of Będzin. And if you have never ever heard of Będzin, it's no surprise because it's not the most famous or the most exciting place in Poland or in the world in general. And as you can see, the house is located in a very unspectacular area that looks a bit sort of like a favela, and you will soon learn about the context of that and the history behind it, and it to some extent explains the way this place looks nowadays. Yeah, so you can see here you can see it from above. It's a drone picture, and you already can see that the place I'm taking you to is underprivileged, poor, rather neglected area in a rather neglected town in Poland. But there are good reasons for us to go there, and my presentation will be dealing with why exactly is that and why anybody would be interested in going there. And my reason for going there were two people who became my dear friends, Karolina and Piotr. They are a married couple, and this story will be about the place, but it will start as a story of people. And I will give you a little bit of a backstory because these two human beings have been very important to me and to the place that we are about to discover. So this is a couple of people from that area, from south of Poland, who were born in that area, a former borderland of Poland, Germany, Czech Republic. So a very interesting historical area. And they've been an inspiration to me because what they did is living in their town, one day they came across a very unspectacular apartment in the building you see in the picture on the right. Again, a very neglected building that used to be a Jewish house. And what they discovered in that apartment, they were looking for an apartment to rent. They were just two people, born in that town, who, like, one of them was born in the town, the other one was born in the neighboring town. They were looking for an apartment to rent. And then they discovered that in one of in that building, there is an apartment with traces of polychromies, as you can see here. And they soon came to realize that this used to be a shtibel, a Jewish prayer house. And when they discovered that, they knew literally nothing about Jewish history, Jewish heritage, Jewish past of their own town. But what they did that day, when they discovered it, they decided to rent it. And they rent it to this day for over 15 years with their own money. What they did is they then decided to renovate the polychromies, to learn the entire history behind this place, to discover the story of the owners of the building, the owners of the shtibel, the entire history of Jewish, very vivid, very vibrant Jewish life of the town of Będzin. They met many descendants of Będzin Jews, and they turned this apartment into a real, like in a little museum, in a cultural center. And they keep doing that, and they keep paying the rent with their own money now as a married couple with 2 children. So this is an extraordinary story of like 2 people who became activists for the cause that, a day before discovering this Stiebel, they had no idea about any of that. And when I asked them once, so why did you do that? I mean, what was the, what sort of made you to do that? They both tell me, we felt very angry. And I said, but what was, where were you angry about? And they said, we were very angry, nobody told us the story. Because, as Polish people born after the war in this particular place in the world, they really felt something was taken away from them because they didn't know this story. So they decided to discover it for themselves and for, their children, for the other inhabitants of the town. It's not, it's not always an easy work. And the way, we use the term memory activist for people like that. So people who, sort of like take on this task of rediscovering, retelling the story of their, of their local town or village or a city, and rediscovering the Jewish story. That's what they started doing. And they turned this Stiebel, this former Stiebel, this place, into a cultural center and a little museum where they, the polychromies are renovated. They are registered as a historical monument now. So it's, they are registered as a historical monument forever. So nobody can, endanger them. They are, a monument to important also historical trace. So that's what they did with this particular apartment. And they organize meetings, cultural events, film screenings, discussions, meetings with descendants. They turned it into a living place. And that's how I met them. And I was really impressed by the work that they do. And I have to tell you that, in some cases, and in their case, it starts as a very lonely work. And only, with time, they actually started getting support and others joining them. But that's not the end. Then they came across a destroyed, half-ruined former pre-burial house in the neighboring city of Gliwice, former German city of Gliwice. As I mentioned, it is, we're in the area of a former borderland. So they came across a Jewish cemetery in the city of Gliwice and a half-ruined pre-burial house.
Ola,
And they also got, yeah.
I'm just interrupting you for a moment because I'm getting it in sequence of questions. Is this couple Jewish?
No, they're Polish non-Jewish activists dealing with Jewish heritage. So this is a pre-burial house. That's how it looked. And thanks to their involvement and some others, it was turned into one of the most beautiful museums in that part of Poland. This is now the Upper Silesian Jewish House of Remembrance. That's beautiful. So that's the main room of the former pre-burial house that now is a museum, and it hosts a most beautiful exhibition about the history of Jewish life and the Holocaust in the Upper Silesia region. So again, this former borderland between Poland and Germany. So it tells the story of Jewish life and of the Holocaust in that particular area. As you can see, it's like beautifully designed. So they got involved in that through their engagement with the, accidentally discovered former Stiebel. They got involved in rescuing this particular building. And then Karolina, the female part of the couple, was for many years the director of this particular institution. And she turned it into a very interesting, center for knowledge, production, education, research on the history of Jews in that particular region. And then, when I thought they're done, they have 2 children, they should focus on their family life, they discovered this building. And this doesn't look like anything spectacular, as I mentioned. It's a house in a very neglected, rather poor district of the town of Będzin. And, it's a tiny plot of land. And there is not much to discover, seemingly, when you just go there. And there are not many reasons for us to go there in the first place. That's where it's located in Poland. So you can see it's south of Poland. It used to be partially, Germany. And the district itself was rather poor and rather neglected district, even at the beginning of the 20th century. And this is exactly where, this is, the picture of the plot and of the house. This is where the Polak family used to live. And this is where the Nazis decided to create the Będzin ghetto. So it was a district with very little access to, sewage system, running water, a very neglected, very poor district. There were some Polish families, Polish non-Jewish families living in that district before the ghetto was established, including the Polak family that you can see in the pictures over here. And the Polak family was one of the very few families that was allowed to some point in time to stay in their house when the ghetto was already operating. So this family then, after the war, came back to that house, and that's how the story of the house is, for us, like we are able to reconstruct the story, but I will come back to that. So this is where the Będzin ghetto was functioning. And it was, as you can see in this picture, you can already see, the material conditions of, living there. So you can see it was very poor. It was mostly like houses made out of stone. It was like most of them had no access to running water. So this is where the ghetto was functioning. And what's fascinating is, this is the house that I was telling you about, that I'm talking to you about, is the house from which a very important letter was sent. It is called the last letter of the Będzin ghetto. So the Będzin ghetto had a very strong resistance movement. And Shirel has already mentioned Frumka Płotnicka, who was one of the very important resistance fighters, who was involved in the resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto, so the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and also in the Będzin Ghetto and the armed resistance that happened there when the Nazis attempted to liquidate the ghetto. So the last letter sent from the Będzin Ghetto was sent from that house that I was showing you. And the letter is very difficult to read. It was sent by the members of the Jewish combat organizations only several days before the final liquidation of the ghettos, both in Będzin and the neighboring city of Sosnowiec. And this letter was then, it ended up in the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, because it was changing hands. And then, it is still, in the resources, in the collection of the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. So it was written by Frumka Płotnicka, who was member of both the pre-war organization DROR and the Jewish Combat Organization. In Polish, it's called JOB, Żydowska Organizacja Bojowa. Hersch Springer, again, DROR and Jewish Combat Organization. Israel Kożuch, Shlomo Lerner, and Zvi Brandes. So different members of different resistance organizations that formed the Jewish Combat Organization. On the 17th of July, 1943, just several days before the ghetto is liquidated, they send a letter. And they say most dramatic things in that letter. They say, "Only today with great joy we receive, after long weeks of waiting, the letter that they were waiting for." And then they go on to say, "Unfortunately, he, the messenger, has been a little late in coming. For years, we have dreamt about an opportunity to tell you about our life and our fight." And by that, they mean the years, all the effort that they've put into, creating the underground resistance movement, in organizing themselves and organizing with others in, the underground resistance that they've all been part of. And we're talking about young people who before the war were members of different youth organizations. And then they say, "We are writing this letter in great haste, since the messenger's times is very pressed." And we can imagine that, because this is really like the situation already is very tense. "We haven't the strength or the patience to write everything to you, what was most important and what we wanted most." And then they go on to say, do whatever you can. I doubt if you can help us in time, since we are nearing our final days. All the youth movements together number no more than a few hundred people. When you receive this letter, there will not be on this soil a single Jewish soul. So this is a very dramatic moment in the history of the Holocaust. And you can imagine they are staying there in the hideout because, as the underground resistance, they were changing hideouts. They were all in hiding. And they're still able to send this last letter. And it is true that they already know that in a couple of days, this will be over. And this letter miraculously survived, and it ended up in the collection of the Jewish Historical Institute. But the house and the hideout from which this letter was sent survived as well. So once we learned about that, we really got strongly involved in trying to discover the history of the house, the story behind it, all the people that were involved in that movement, and all the people who were sort of like the context for this letter being sent. So there are testimonies. There is Frumka Płotnicka, there is Heike Klinger, there are other people who left testimonies that allow us to reconstruct the story of what happened in that house. What is extraordinary is that we also know that survivors, those who managed to survive, they came back to Poland in 1947, and they created and installed a plaque on the wall of that house. And the plaque is the most, beautiful and moving monument. And it's one of the first monuments to the Holocaust in that part of Poland, because we're talking about 1947. So there is a monument in Warsaw to the Holocaust erected in 1947, but this is south of Poland. So this is one of the first monuments to the Holocaust in that part of Poland. And you can see survivors here. And you can see a plaque behind that. And this is the plaque on the wall of the house we're talking about. And the plaque says that, these people were fighting for the dignity of Jewish nation, independent Poland, and freedom of all mankind. And you can see still fairly young people in this picture, right? So these are friends and colleagues of the people who were murdered in the liquidation of that ghetto. So of the people who wrote this last letter. And when I first came to that particular place, Karolina and Piotr showed me the place, and already what I discovered is that the plaque that is on the wall was renovated, and it was one of the first things that Karolina and Piotr, the two activists I was telling you about, did. When the house was in private hands, but they managed to convince the owners to renovate the plaque. And what's fascinating is the plaque has been there for all these years. It was 1947, it was then placed there. And then, decades, passing, the plaque was there, getting older and less readable, but it was there. And then it was one of the first things Karolina and Piotr did when they discovered the house. They renovated the plaque with the permission of the owners. And you can see that here on the left, you see the original picture of the, of the installation of the plaque and then of the renovation. And then Karolina and Piotr got more and more involved in discovering the story of the house. And they started thinking that this should be something that, should be referred to as the Ghetto Fighters' House in Będzin, because that's what it actually is. It's a house where the Jewish combat organizations, where the underground resistance fighters were, from where they were organizing part of the resistant movement in that particular place, but also, as part of the wider network of resistance that was, happening and being organized in occupied Poland. So the house itself, as you can see, was nothing spectacular, but it was fairly preserved. And it was fascinating to discover that, not that many things in that house have changed since, the 40s. There were some renovations done, but the house, its materiality is preserved. So what you can see here, and, it's not exactly, but it's more or less how the house used to look in the 40s, so when the resistance fighters, the Jewish combat organizations was using this house as a hideout, including the basement, which was part of the hideout. So this is a contemporary photo of the basement of the house. And this is exactly where they partially were hiding. So what we know now and what we know from testimonies is they were, there was a secret entrance to the hideout that was, in the basement, and from the basement there was a tunnel going to another, hideout that was under the barn in the yard of the house. But we knew that from testimonies. So we knew that there was a barn in the garden, and you can see the barn behind the children playing in the yard. So we knew that the hideout, the second part of the hideout, was located under the barn. So that's what the testimonies were saying. So then Karolina and Piotr started investigating the house and collaborating closely with the family, the Polak family, the family of the owners. And until a point, they were able to do that research and do these investigations with the family, being still legal owners. But then they decided that, for this house to become what they envision it should become, it has to be turned into an institution. So with the help of many descendants of Będzin Jews, they decided to purchase the house. And this was done a year ago. So December last year, they, raised money, purchased the house, and then could continue, a more extensive research into the history and the materiality of the house. And when we started investigating the house, it was, the yard was completely overgrown, and you can see here on the right, Karolina cutting the plants for the research, for non-invasive research to be conducted, and I will talk about it more in a moment. But you can see it's completely overgrown because, the family wasn't using that house for already some time, so it was just standing there. And we started with, mobilizing the experts that we knew, and trying to do first non-invasive research. So what you see here in this picture is a ground-penetrating radar. Because on the basis of the testimonies, we knew that, the members of the Jewish combat organizations were hiding in that house. They had a hideout that was located under the barn, that, the hideout was connected to the house by a tunnel. So we thought, okay, so there have to be traces of that. And when we conducted the first research in the yard without, any invasive work, what we discovered in the basement was traces of the entrance to what we thought can be a tunnel. And then, in the garden itself, this is Aleksandra Schwartz doing, the ground penetrating radar research. So this is the basement. So here, through that basement, there was from that basement, there was an entrance to a tunnel, and the tunnel was connecting the basement with an underground hideout. And this is a ground penetrating radar image, so it's difficult to understand for somebody who doesn't deal normally with this kind of data, for a non-expert eye. But what this shows you are anomalies underground, and these anomalies confirmed that there is something underground in the garden that might be the tunnel we were looking for. So this was a hint for us, saying that, it's worth investigating this house, it's worth preserving it, because surely there are traces of that, creativity of resistance that was, invested there by these people who were trying to survive and trying to organize armed resistance there. So on the basis of that research, we then, together collectively with another researcher, Natalia Romik, we created a first exhibition about the house in Warsaw as part of the Zinger Festival in Warsaw, to tell the story of the house, to show the research that was conducted already, and raise awareness about, not only this particular place, but also the topic of armed Jewish resistance under Nazi occupation in Poland. And that led to archaeological studies, because Once the house was purchased by Karolina and Piotr, it was possible to then, work and like use invasive methods to investigate the area. So what we knew from testimonies is that it is true that the members of the Jewish combat organizations were murdered there during the liquidation of the Będzin ghetto. However, we knew also that there are no burials there in the garden itself. So it was possible to investigate, to carry out an archaeological investigation. It was done with the rabbinical supervision, for the reasons of the rules of the halacha. However, we knew that it's very unlikely that we would encounter any burials in the garden. However, what you can see here is that, only quite, not that big layer, not that wide layer of ground had to be uncovered to discover remains, not only of the yard, of the former, buildings in the yard, but also of something that most likely was, the hideout and the tunnel leading to that hideout. So you can see here, this is the process of uncovering of the archaeological works. And what's also important is that, as we were doing the non-invasive research when, the garden was still overgrown, the tunnel that we expected to meet there was located more or less where the ground penetrating radar was indicating that it should be located. So you can see already what was the infrastructure there. So the house was, located in one part of the plot, and then, on the left corner, down in the left corner, that's where the barn used to be. So the archaeologists who are experienced in working with in Jewish cemeteries, because there is a special archaeological project carried out here in Warsaw at the Jewish cemetery, they are trained to work with Jewish heritage sites, especially also with Jewish burial grounds. So they know all the rules. They are used to working with rabbinical supervision. So they were this was the team who was discovering this particular hideout. And you can see here they are discovering different constructions underground, and you can see, how shallow, these constructions, how shallow they are located. And you can see, foundations of buildings and also part of the infrastructure. And this is the bunker that we were looking for. So the archaeologists actually discovered the second part of the hideout of the Jewish combat organization in Będzin in the garden of that very house. So you can see here the construction is the bunker that was located under the barn, the one that we knew about from testimonies. We weren't expecting that we would discover this, but once the archaeological work started, it was clear that all the infrastructure that was there in the 40s remained there. And part of the reasons why it was preserved was also poverty. So this district was underdeveloped during after the Second World War. People who were living there didn't have resources to invest in in major renovations. So more or less everything there was in the state or in the shape that it was back in the 40s during the Second World War. So this is when for the first time the remains of the bunker were discovered, and you can see here other parts of the infrastructure in the garden, including the tunnel leading to that hideout. So as I told you, from the basement, there was a tunnel connecting the basement with the bunker that was located in the garden. And from the testimonies, we knew already that the way the events unravel is when the liquidation of the Będzin ghetto was already approaching. Certain members of the Jewish combat organization, including Frumka Płotnicka, one of the prominent leaders of the resistance movement, were hiding in that hideout. They sent the letter, and then they were preparing themselves for armed resistance. And obviously it was a completely unequal fight, and it was more also in their words about dying with dignity as they defined it. So what happened is this hideout, once the ghetto was liquidated, this and many other hideouts were discovered. these young people, the resistance fighters, they were murdered here in this very house, in this very garden. However, they weren't buried there. So this is where they were, this was a place of their last attempt to fight against the perpetrators. And so this is, the traces of their resistance, like the bunker and the hideout, are still there. And when this bunker was discovered, this is, in the process of discovering, the bunker by the archaeologist, there were many objects found inside, belonging to different periods, of time. So also like post-war objects, that were sort of like, collected there over decades. So you can see here the archaeologists actually, going through piles of bricks and everyday objects and just simply, garbage that was found in that very place. And this is, you see them sort of like resting after they are all on the left. This is the leader of the archaeological team resting, after they uncover most of it. But you can also see the perimeter of the bunker. So, it was quite a construction. You could stand inside, as you can see in the photo on the left. So that was done this past summer. And, there were many, once this was uncovered, there were many guided tours organized to that place. Because once the story was, discovered and the archaeological works confirmed what we suspected is the story of this house, tours started coming. And, during the time of the archaeological works, there were also many groups that were coming to see to see the remains of the bunker, to see the hideout, to see what's left of this particular place and the story behind it. But also Karolina and Piotr started interviewing the neighbors of the house, the neighbors of the site, and people who can still remember and have the memory of certain events that happened. So they started collecting testimonies, not only from descendants and from survivors and their children and grandchildren, but also from bystanders, from people, from the immediate area. Although when the ghetto was functioning in Będzin, most of the Polish non-Jewish people were expelled from their houses, but these people came back after the war. And obviously, they discovered, hiding places, parts of, like the organized life in the Będzin ghetto. So they started, collecting interviews and stories and carrying out workshops, including artistic workshops like this one carried out by a dear friend of mine, Natalia Romik, who, started working with the local community with objects that were found during the archaeological works, and collecting stories of, we're talking to people who can still remember immediate post-war or like war times, or their children and grandchildren. So, the workshop focused on objects, and then, people were also like attaching certain meanings or interpretations to these objects that were discovered during the archaeological works. And you can see here, this is in Polish, but somebody, because in part, as part of the workshop, they were interpreting this object, and somebody wrote "broken life" and attached this piece of paper to this particular object. And then these objects were turned into artistic objects, into sculptures by Natalia Romik, who is an artist. She's a Jewish artist from Poland, specialized in like material objects related to the Holocaust. And this is, she created these installations with the use of the archaeological objects found in this particular hideout. So you can see these objects exhibited in Będzin, in the house that I'm talking about. And the question is, what is the future of this particular place? Because as you have seen, the house was purchased. The story of the house is being uncovered. The archaeological works were the proof that the hideout, the bunker, the tunnel, everything that we knew from testimonies and from stories is actually still there. So the materiality of that story is preserved. So the vision for the future is to create a cultural center and a research institution in that particular place. And this is just a visualization done by architects to create a place that uses the garden, the materiality of the remains of the hideout and the bunker and the house itself, for the purpose of carrying out educational activities. And I can tell you that already over the past years, there were hundreds of people visiting that place, mostly organized groups, but not exclusively, who were coming there to see the house, to hear the story. So there is a huge demand for that story being told. So there are attempts and there are various, concepts for how this house and the garden can be used as a cultural research educational center that can accommodate groups of visitors, but also that can serve as an institution that also produces knowledge about this particular part of the story, or like chapter of the story, about resistance, about youth organizations and their role in the resistance during the Nazi occupation, and also create space for like both research and artistic residencies, because it is a house. It can host artists or researchers who can be at residency there to carry out research. So it is this is one of the visions for the future of the house. There are at the moment multiple types of events happening there, like exhibitions, temporary exhibitions, workshops, guided tour, lectures, ceremonies. This year there was a ceremony organized at the for the anniversary of the liquidation of the Będzin ghetto. And what's interesting is also that the neighbors, so people who live in the neighboring houses, and descendants of the Jews from Będzin, but also survivors from this and other ghettos in the area. People are coming to celebrate these anniversaries, so it can be a meeting point where various people connected with this particular materiality and this particular story are getting together. So this is a vision for what this place could be. And as I was involved in the research around this story, I have a privilege also of supporting Karolina and Piotr in their journey with this particular place, and being part of the process of thinking about what this place can be turned into, so that it's first and foremost doing justice to the story and the memory of people who were trying to survive there, were fighting for their lives there, and then the memory of their bravery, creativity and resistance, but also the history of the resistance movement as such, and even more to the youth movement that were the founding sort of stone for the resistance movement in that particular area. So Karolina and Piotr were in the US lately to talk about the project and raise funds for building an institution in that particular house. And what we're thinking about now is how to integrate this particular place into the wider context of the Będzin, the former Będzin ghetto, and to also make sure that it's relevant not only for people all around the world, but also for the people living next to it. And there are currently multiple projects carried out by Karolina and Piotr that are actually aimed at also involving people from the area, so people from Będzin, people who are neighbors of this particular building. So they're also involved in remembrance work, and also making sure that this house becomes not only part of the international history of the Holocaust, but also part of the local memory culture, so the memory culture of Będzin as such. And luckily there are many descendants of Będzin Jews all around the world, and they are already involved in that process. So it's a multi-stakeholder process. It involves, the neighbors in the town of Będzin, the international community of, descendants of Jews from Będzin, including, children of survivors who are, connected with this particular story. But it's also relevant, and you can see Karolina and Piotr and their children here, that also it becomes relevant for future generations. So this is something that is the biggest, sort of question and task for people who are part of that process is that, this institution can becomes relevant not only for this, local story, but also for those who will come and will take that forward. So maybe I'll stop here, and I'm very happy to answer all the questions that you might have.
Perfect. Yes, there are many. And I'll just put you in speaker view so that I can see you. Okay, I'm going to start with a few about Carolina and Piotr and then move into wartime and then contemporary because they just kept streaming in. So one question about Carolina and Piotr is, or I'll bundle them up. What did they do before they discovered the Stiebel and turned into what they're doing today, and how today do they sustain themselves, or how did they support themselves at the time where they were not yet fully invested and just stumbled upon this place?
Yes, so they both graduated from arts. So Piotr, was a fine arts academy student, and Carolina was studying curating, and they both hoped to go into arts, and life had different plans for them. So they were still, they barely, when they discovered the Stiebel, they just barely graduated. So they were, just young people just out of, college. And then they both worked in culture and arts, like working in galleries, as graphic designers, like all these, and they partially still do. So they combine their activist work with trying to make a living using the skills they have. And they established a foundation, and I'm happy to share the link to their website in the chat right now. They established the foundation, and through that foundation, they were able to apply for funds to help sustain the Stiebel and then other activities. They published multiple books, but this is mostly like their voluntary work. And after that, Carolina became the director of the Upper Silesian Jewish House of Remembrance and the pre-burial house in Gliwice. So that was part also of their careers, and now they're fully dedicated. Starting I think at 6 months ago, they decided to dedicate their time and efforts to that house and that story fully. So now they're mostly working to turn this into an institution.
Amazing. So one more question about that on a broader sense. You mentioned when you asked them about their motivation, they spoke of anger. And I know you also work a lot with non-Jewish Polish people around these issues of remembrance. Is this a sentiment that you see often? Because it sounds very uncommon that a couple that have no relationship suddenly finds themselves in this. Is it common? Is it?
I wouldn't say, there are many memory activists across Poland, and I think their motivations are very different and very diverse. I think what's particularly impressive about Carolina and Piotr is that they really felt that something was taken away, from that. They really they felt angry that nobody told them the story, that they were born in this, she was born in that town, and somehow this history was hidden from her. Nobody talked about. She wasn't, nobody taught at school about that history. So this was sort of I think her motivation and their motivations was coming from they were angry about the oblivion and the neglect, and through that they had a very strong motivation to change it. And obviously, this is we're talking about two activists in a town. So, it's not I wouldn't say that's very common. And also in a town like this, you have the two people, right? So that's not a lot. So they were confronted with, certain resistance and, and challenges and, different sentiments. But they kept going, and it's been over 15 years. So they also managed to change the attitudes of some of the people living there, but obviously not all of them.
Thank you. I'll just mention again that if you have a question or a comment, you can send it in the direct chat. And I'm going to skip to more questions. One is, was the tunnel originally dug? Like, was it part of the house or was it dug during the war? And the other one is, do we know if they were armed? The resistance group, do we know if they were armed in those last final days?
So when it comes to the tunnel, it was created by the resistance fighters. So what we know, because I've mentioned that the Polak family, so the family that owned the house before and after the war, which is important because there is a continuation of like memory in that particular family. So the family was still living there when the hideout was used. So thanks to members of this family, this Polish non-Jewish family, we know that they were digging, with whatever tools they have, they were digging the tunnel. So we assume with spoons and other, like everyday tools. And they created, the secret entrance, the tunnel, and the bunker under the barn. So this was something that was created by the resistance fighters. And, as part of my other, projects, I did research on hideouts on the territory, wartime Jewish hideouts on the territory of contemporary Poland and Ukraine. And I know this was a common approach at that time. So, creating these sorts of hideouts under houses or under, barns or other similar buildings is something we came across in other places as well. And were they armed? I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah. So we know, yes, I mean, there was shortage of arms, even in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, as we know. So, they probably had some, we don't know exactly what they have at their disposal, but, regardless of that, this was like a completely unequal fight. So we know from the testimonies that they had some, but, this could have been different things, not necessarily like, for example, pistols, but, other forms of arms, but obviously not near enough.
Another question was, do we know what was their fate, like of the resistance, or do we know where they're buried, or what happened after?
So what we also know from the Polak family, so the Polish non-Jewish family, is that, shortly after the liquidation of the ghetto, members of that family came to the house because they've heard of what happened in the ghetto. So, they wanted to see, if the houses are still standing and everything. So the lady came back, and what she said is that, that she encountered a German person, a soldier, who told her that she can only enter if she has a strong heart. And then what she saw in the garden was bodies of the resistance fighters that were murdered there on the spot. So as for all the people who died during the liquidation of the ghetto in this particular town and neighboring towns, it was not far away from Auschwitz. So in many cases, the bodies of the people murdered there were taken from there.
Okay, I'm just going on with the questions because they're coming in and piling up. It's very interesting. I received questions about the Polak family, asking if they were recognized as righteous nation and asking if they were punished by the German or the Jews, which kind of both sides of these questions, we don't know their role in this. So maybe you can say a little about their role and how they're recognized.
So as far as we know, they had not a particular, I mean, I would classify that as bystanders. So, so I wouldn't consider them particularly helping. They were just living in the ghetto, and because they were allowed to, they weren't instrumental in the resistance fighters, surviving. So this wasn't like a relationship of like, help and support, but they also knew about them, and they were just so they were there and they were sort of like observing what was happening. So none of the consequences that you've asked about happened to them. So they weren't recognized, and they weren't punished either, because they weren't instrumental in the things happening. They were just there, and thanks to them and the testimonies and their testimonies, we know part of the story, and the other part we know from the survivors, right? So that's sort of how that worked. But what is important also is that what we think is also important to sort of like understand the Polak family a little bit more is that when the survivors came to place a plaque on the building, they needed to at least agree to that, and then they maintained the plaque, right? They never, so we know that this history was important to them, to the family, and we know they were also telling this story and sharing this story. And although the different generations of the family were inhabiting the house, the plaque remain. And so this is also something that I think they considered the part of the story of the place.
There are a few questions here about Będzin, like the town and the ghetto in general. I don't know if you have numbers off the top of your mind, but people are asking like if we know how many survived, if we know how many were there, if we have an idea of like the scale of what was going on in that town.
So I'm not a historian and an expert in the Będzin ghetto. However, it wasn't one of the biggest ghettos in occupied Poland, but it was a former borderland, so it was an important, let's say, place in terms of before the war. All sorts of like industrial and business connections between Poland, Germany, and other places. So I think from until 1942, approximately 2,400 people were deported from the town to the killing centers, so to the death camps. And then in 1943, around 18,000 still were living in the town, and then in the beginning of August the liquidation started. So you can sort of like have the approximate numbers of what we're talking about.
Were there any survivors? I mean, you're talking to descendants, so do you know how many survivors there were?
So I don't know the exact number of survivors. I'm happy to check that with Karolina and Piotr, because they really know all about that. And if there are numbers, I'm sure they know it. But what we know is that there is quite an active group of descendants of survivors in Israel. So there have been, there were survivors, and they were organized.
Okay, I'm moving on to slightly different questions. There's one is when were the interviews conducted? Because people are dying. Like we don't have many people from that time. And are there still people that you are looking to interview? And the other, maybe the one we'll close with, even though there are many more, is how is this received by the Polish state, by Poland? Is it supported? Is it a state issue, or is it a county or town issue? How is it received?
When it comes to interviews, so luckily, we have access to many testimonies that were collected, let's say, independently of the initiative Discovering of the House. So, people like figures like Frumka Płotnicka, Heika Klinger, so in prominent figures in the resistance movement. We either have, like, for Heika Klinger, who was also part of that movement, we have her diaries, we have testimonies, we have a book of her son. So there are resources that were collected after the war that shed light on that story that we have access to. When it comes to interviews, some interviews were connected among the survivors. Karolina and Piotr have been doing this work for 15 years. They didn't know about the house back then, but they knew about the ghetto. So they were collecting testimonies about the history of the ghetto, regardless of the house itself. And they are in great relationships with many, descendants. So they also have access to family archives. And when they managed to interview the Polak family, so people who were children during the war, but also like had memory of that. So they weren't like little children; they were children during the war, so they had memories of the ghetto. So they also have testimonies of members of the Polak family, and now they are mostly interviewing also people in the area, and still like people who were children during the war. And when it comes to relationship between this, so Karolina and Piotr, they have their foundation. It's a non-governmental organization. Through that, they operate and they're organizing projects. However, now they're as of I think this year, they are also officially supported by the Ministry of Culture and National Heritage. So this became of interest for national institutions, and now they're like in collaboration with Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. They're conducting research around this particular history.
I'm gonna slide in another last question, although it's time, so just a very short, if it's possible. This memory work, as reality piles new things daily, how do you see the importance of this to contemporary Poland and to the next generations?
So, I mean, I think this is very important, and that's why I also personally became involved in this work. So, first and foremost, I think this is really important that we have these materially preserved traces of this history. And I think it's both like this place is important as evidence, and as we're confronted with distortion and denial, and distortion of history, I think this is really important that we have material evidence. And secondly, this also is very important because it shows, the stories of resistance are, I think, particularly important because they also show, these people who were there, these young people were activists in the face of, a tragedy and injustice and genocide. And I think it's very important, and the Holocaust as such. And I think it's very important that we also tell this story, the story of these particular, this group of people, but also the power of resistance, and also I think it might be extremely relevant if we think, of like broader issues like democracy, and connections between people and organizations, because that also, when we read these testimonies, what is clear is how dedicated they were to each other, and how actually the way they organized themselves and this like collective movement allowed them to to sustain the movement, and also face this situation for such a long time. And obviously many, like most of them, were murdered and did not survive, but some of them managed to survive, and others left this like powerful testimonies that are really important. These are important stories to take forward, and this letter in particular, I think, is a treasure that should have a prominent place in the history and remembrance work.
Ola, thank you so much for this presentation.
Thank you so much.